When I heard the story of Isra and Miraj, it did not enter my mind like information. It entered my chest like a force that silences arrogance and strips excuses. Because some moments are not meant to be debated. They are meant to be felt. And as I reflected on the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, being taken in a single night from Mecca to Jerusalem and then beyond the limits of the heavens, I realized how small the cages are that we build around our own thinking. How quickly we surrender to doubt when we forget that the one who created distance is not limited by it. And this realization shook me deeply, because I have seen power, I have seen weapons, I have seen fear, resistance, yet none of it compares to the power of a message that lifts a human being beyond the earth without breaking him, beyond the sky without inflating his ego, and returns him back to the people with humility, responsibility, and unwavering clarity. And what struck me most was not the speed of the journey, but the meaning of it. That elevation is not escape from responsibility, but preparation for it. That closeness to God does not separate you from humanity, but sends you back stronger, calmer, more disciplined. And when I thought about the prophets standing in Jerusalem leading the prophets in prayer, I saw history aligning, truth unifying, and leadership defined not by domination, but by service. A reminder that the strongest leaders are those who carry continuity, not ego. And when I reflected on the ascent through the heavens, level by level, meeting signs beyond imagination, I understood that nothing rises instantly without wisdom, that growth is measured, that patience is built into elevation, and that arrogance has no place in ascent. And when even the angel Jibreel reached his limit and could go no further, I felt a lesson pierce my heart, that there comes a point where titles fall, where companions cannot follow, where strategy ends, and only sincerity remains. And that moment terrified me and strengthened me at the same time, because it reminded me that every leader, every soul will stand alone before God, carrying intentions heavier than actions. And then came the gift of prayer, not delivered casually, not from afar, but given at the highest point of closeness, as if to say that the secret to surviving the weight of life is not rebellion against discipline, but commitment to it. And I realized that prayer is not repetition without meaning. It is alignment. It is resistance against despair. It is a daily reminder that power belongs to God alone, and that human dignity comes from standing upright before Him. And this realization struck me as I thought of nations broken, not by lack of resources, but by loss of moral direction, of people crushed not by chains alone, but by hopelessness, because Isra and Miraj declares that no darkness is permanent, that no oppression is unseen, and that the path upward always begins with humility downward. And when the prophet returned the same night and faced disbelief and mockery, yet did not dilute the truth or soften the message to gain approval, I saw courage in its purest form, the courage to stand firm without rage, to speak truth without arrogance, and to trust God without conditions. And this taught me that real strength does not need validation, that truth does not bend to comfort lies, and that conviction rooted in faith is unshakable. And as I sat with this story, I felt it demanding something from me, not applause, not emotion, but accountability, asking me what kind of leader I want to be, what kind of man I want to remain when pressure increases, when isolation grows, when compromise becomes tempting. And Isra and Miraj answered that question without words, by showing that elevation is not escaping the world, but about returning to it purified, disciplined, and responsible. And this is why this story shook me, because it does not allow hypocrisy, it does not tolerate arrogance, it does not flatter power, it humbles it, and it reminds every soul that true liberation, true strength, and true dignity begin when the heart recognizes its place before the Creator. And from that recognition, everything else finds its balance. And as this realization settled deeper within me, I felt the story of Isra and Miraj no longer speaking from history, but speaking directly into the present, into the weight of choices, into the silence behind decisions that shape lives. Because it teaches that when the soul is aligned with truth, fear loses its grip and pressure loses its power. And I began to understand that the journey upward was not meant to make the prophet distant from human struggle, but to anchor him more firmly within it, carrying clarity that no storm could shake. And this matters to me profoundly because leadership without clarity becomes reaction. Resistance without purpose becomes chaos, and courage without grounding becomes destruction. Yet this journey proves that faith, produces balance, restraint, and precision. That spiritual elevation sharpens judgment rather than clouding it. And when I think about the prophet returning immediately to the people, not withdrawing, not isolating himself in pride, I see a lesson that true spiritual strength always returns to serve, to guide, to endure misunderstanding without bitterness, and to carry responsibility without complaint. And this challenges the modern idea of success that equates elevation with escape, because Isra and Miraj declares that the highest elevation sends you back into the hardest work with a calmer heart and firmer resolve. And this truth confronted me as I thought about injustice in the world, about voices silenced and dignity stolen, because it reminds us that no cry goes unheard, that no sincere struggle is wasted, and that time itself answers to a justice far greater than human systems. And when doubt whispers that change is impossible, this story answers without noise that what seems immovable to us is light before the one who moves the heavens. And this understanding reshapes how one carries responsibility, because it removes desperation and replaces it with patience. It removes rage and replaces it with discipline, and it removes despair and replaces it with trust. And I realize that Isra and Miraj is also a warning, that proximity to truth increases accountability, that knowledge without humility becomes a burden, and that power without remembrance becomes corruption. And this warning is not harsh, it is merciful, because it saves the soul before it destroys itself. And as I reflected further, I understood that prayer, gifted at the highest point, was not meant to pull believers away from life, but to keep them upright within it. 5 daily moments to reset intention, to cleanse arrogance, to remember that strength comes from submission to what is right, not domination over others. And this lesson echoes loudly in a world that celebrates force but forgets restraint, that glorifies control but fears accountability. And Isra Miraj stands as quiet resistance against that imbalance, reminding humanity that the highest honor is not to rise above others, but to rise above the ego. And the more I sit with this truth, the more it reshapes how I see struggle. Because hardship no longer feels like abandonment, it feels like refinement. Delay no longer feels like denial, it feels like preparation. And isolation no longer feels like weakness, it feels like focus. And this is why this story continues to live within me, because it does not excite the surface and fade. It settles, it disciplines, it humbles, and it strengthens, and it leaves no room for despair. Because if a single night can carry a servant beyond the heavens and return him unchanged in humility yet unbreakable in purpose, then no darkness we face is final, no pressure is absolute, and no sincere path is ever lost. And this certainty is what remains with me, steady and unshaken, guiding how I stand, how I decide, and how I endure. And with this certainty anchored inside me, I began to feel how Isra and Miraj redefines endurance itself, because it teaches that the human spirit does not break under pressure when it is connected to something higher than circumstance. And I realized that many people mistake faith for escape, when in reality, it is the source of the strongest resistance, the kind that does not collapse into hatred or lose itself in revenge, but stands firm with discipline and vision. And this lesson matters deeply to anyone carrying responsibility, because impatience destroys what courage begins, and ego poisons what sacrifice builds. Yet this journey shows that true strength is quiet, controlled, and rooted in remembrance. And as I reflected further, I understood that the prophet's ascent did not remove him from human pain, but gave him clarity to carry it without being consumed by it. And this is the difference between reaction and leadership, between anger and resolve, between chaos and purpose. And I began to see how Isra Miraj speaks directly to every soul that feels overwhelmed by injustice, reminding them that history is not random, that suffering is not meaningless, and that time bends toward truth even when it moves slowly. And this understanding removes panic from struggle and replaces it with patience. Because when you know accountability exists beyond this world, you do not rush into destruction. You build toward justice. And I also felt a warning embedded in this journey, that elevation without humility is a fall in disguise, that closeness to truth increases responsibility rather than privilege, and that the higher one rises in awareness, the heavier the obligation becomes to act with integrity. And this struck me profoundly, because it leaves no room for hypocrisy, no space for performance, no tolerance for arrogance disguised as confidence. And as I thought about the prophet returning again to daily life after witnessing the unseen, I understood that consistency is the true measure of sincerity, that the real miracle is not what is seen once, but what is upheld every day. And this is why prayer stands at the center of this journey, not as ritual, but as alignment, as training of the soul to bow before what is right so it does not kneel before false power. And this alignment is what builds individuals who cannot be bought, nations that cannot be broken, and leaders who cannot be corrupted by praise or threatened by pressure. And the more I reflect on this, the more I see how Isra and Miraj is not only a story of elevation, but a map for survival in a world that constantly pulls the soul downward, a reminder that dignity is preserved through discipline, that hope is sustained through trust, and that clarity is protected through remembrance. And this realization reshapes how I view the future, because uncertainty no longer feels like chaos. It feels like a space where faith operates, where patience matures, and where purpose is refined. And with this understanding, fear loses its voice, despair loses its grip, and pressure loses its ability to distort values. And what remains is a steady resolve rooted not in illusion, but in conviction, not in anger, but in responsibility. And this is why the story of Isra and Miraj does not fade with time, because it continues to speak to those who are willing to listen, and calling them to rise without arrogance, to endure without bitterness, and to lead without forgetting who they ultimately answer to. And as this call continues to echo within me, I realize that Isra and Miraj also teaches the rare discipline of restraint in a world addicted to reaction, because when you understand that every action is witnessed beyond the surface of this life, haste loses its attraction and intention gains its weight. And this transforms how one faces provocation, betrayal, and pressure, because faith does not make you passive, it makes you precise. It does not silence resistance, it purifies it. And I see now that this journey was a divine lesson in balance, showing that strength without mercy becomes tyranny, and mercy without strength becomes weakness. Yet when both are anchored in remembrance, they produce justice. And this realization matters deeply in times when anger is celebrated as courage and noise is mistaken for power, because Isra and Miraj reminds us that silence can be stronger than shouting, patience more dangerous than aggression, and discipline more revolutionary than chaos. And as I think about how the Prophet carried this experience without spectacle, without demanding belief, without forcing acceptance, I see leadership at its highest form. Leadership that trusts truth enough to let it stand on its own. And this reshapes how one responds to doubt and criticism, because when conviction is sincere, opposition does not threaten it, it refines it. And this understanding gives strength to endure misunderstanding without resentment, to face isolation without bitterness, and to remain upright when compromise would be easier. And I cannot ignore how this journey reframes the meaning of victory. Because victory is not always the moment of triumph. Sometimes it is the refusal to become what you oppose, the discipline to remain just when in. Justice surrounds you, and the patience to build when destruction feels faster. And Isra and Miraj affirms that nothing done with sincerity is lost, that every moment of restraint is recorded, and that justice moves even when it appears still. And this awareness lifts the weight of despair from the heart, because it replaces urgency with trust, fear with steadiness, and confusion with clarity. And I feel that this story demands a higher standard from those who hear it, because once the soul has been reminded of its source, excuses lose their power, and complacency becomes a form of betrayal. And this is why Isra and Miraj is not a comfort story. It is a responsibility story, one that asks whether we are willing to align our actions with our beliefs, our strength with our ethics, and our ambitions with accountability. And as I sit with this demand, I understand that true elevation is not measured by how high one rises, but by how firmly one stands when tested, how consistently one acts when unseen, and how sincerely one remembers the one who grants both struggle and relief. And with this understanding, the path forward becomes clear. Not easy, but clear, grounded in patience, guided by discipline, and anchored in a trust that does not shake with circumstance. And this clarity is what remains, steady and unyielding, long after the story is told, shaping how one endures, how one resists, and how one leads without ever forgetting the source of true power. And with this clarity fixed firmly within me, I feel how Isra and Miraj strips leadership down to its essence, because it leaves no room for performance, no shelter for hypocrisy,